They sat me in the back seat like a parcel, and only then did I realize no one had bothered to ask if I even wanted to go. At 79, you grow used to being spoken over. But that morning, when my daughter clipped my seatbelt with a sharp, impatient click, something inside me trembled, not from weakness, but from warning. "I told you, Mom, it's just a routine exam," Clara said, eyes fixed on the road as if she were afraid to meet mine. Routine. That word usually means don't ask questions. I asked anyway. "Who is this doctor? I've never heard his name." Her husband, Mark, answered instead. "He specializes in evaluating seniors." He hesitated on the last word, and the way he said it made me feel like a crate with fragile stickers slapped on the sides. The rest of the drive passed in a silence that felt padded, deliberate. They kept glancing at each other in the rearview mirror, as if rehearsing something behind their eyes. I folded my hands in my lap, trying to quiet the unease settling under my ribs. I've lived long enough to know when people are hiding the real reason they need you somewhere. The clinic wasn't our usual one. Too new, too polished. The kind of place you take someone when you don't want anyone asking follow-up questions. A receptionist greeted us with a smile so empty it was almost an insult. "Mrs. Hill, the doctor will see you right away." Right away. No forms, no explanations, no nurses taking vitals. I'd been to enough appointments in my life to know this wasn't how real medicine worked. Clara placed a hand on my elbow, guiding me to the door as if I might wander off into traffic. "Just be honest," she whispered. "It'll be quick." Honest about what? The doctor was a thin, handsome man in an expensive suit. Too expensive for someone who claimed to be a physician. He didn't shake my hand, didn't even introduce himself properly. He only gestured toward a chair. "Mrs. Hill," he said, lowering his voice to something meant to sound comforting. "I have one question for you. Only one. Imagine that. Nearly 8 decades of living reduced to a single inquiry." He leaned forward. "Do you feel capable of making your own decisions?" I stared at him, stunned by the bluntness of it. "Of course I do," I said. "Why wouldn't I?" He wrote something down, a short note, barely more than a flick of his pen, and closed the folder in front of him with a quiet, decisive snap. "That will be all." All? No tests, no scans, no discussion about my health. Nothing. Clara blinked. "Already? We just got here." "Yes," the doctor replied, still not looking at me. "This concludes the appointment." As Mark helped me out of the chair, I felt something cold slide down my spine. They were too relieved, too eager to get me back into the car, too careful not to let me see whatever the doctor had scribbled on that paper. Outside, the wind was sharp enough to pull tears from my eyes, but I knew that wasn't why I was blinking so much. I may be old, but I'm not blind. They weren't checking on my health. They were checking on my usefulness. Clara slammed the car door behind me, softer this time, almost guilty. I watched the clinic shrink as we drove away, and a quiet, heavy certainty settled over me like dust. Something had just happened in that room, something that wasn't meant for my understanding. But they had forgotten one thing. Age doesn't make a woman helpless. It only makes her patient. And I had just begun paying attention. The house felt unfamiliar when we returned, as if someone had rearranged the walls while we were gone. Clara walked ahead, dropping her purse on the console with a clatter that betrayed nerves she was trying to hide. Mark pretended to scroll through his phone, though I could see his thumb hovering, unmoving. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. I've always believed that the truth hides in the smallest things. Tones of voice, slammed drawers, the way people refuse to look directly at you. And that evening, the air in my own living room felt thick with something unspoken. "Well," Clara said too brightly, "that's done. That's done." As if I had just signed up for a newsletter or bought a blender on sale. "What did the doctor say?" I asked. They froze. Just a flicker, but enough. Guilt moves fast across the face of a liar. "Oh, nothing much," Mark answered quickly. "Routine stuff. He'll send the report." "I'd like to see it." Clara's smile twitched. "Mom, you don't need to worry about paperwork. We'll handle it." There it was again. "We'll handle it." The phrase people use when they want to take something out of your hands before you ask why. I walked past them to the kitchen, pretending I needed tea. My hands moved automatically, boiling water, finding the tin with the chamomile bags. It's a strange thing. The older you get, the more suspicious you become of kindness that comes without explanation. "Behind me," they whispered. They always thought their voices didn't carry, but sound travels differently in a quiet house. "Worked faster than I expected," Mark muttered. "She didn't argue. That's good," Clara whispered back. "We just need the paperwork then." Her voice dropped too low to catch the rest. I didn't turn around. If you want people to speak freely, you must pretend to be deaf. I let the kettle whistle long and loud while I processed what I'd heard. Paperwork. Worked faster than I expected. She didn't argue. I stirred my tea and watched the steam spiral upward like a silent warning. Something was unfolding around me, not with violence or shouting, but with polite smiles and lowered voices, the kind of harm wrapped in soft fabric. The phone rang then, slicing through the tension. Clara hurried to answer before I could move. "Hello? Yes, this is she. Oh, yes, we did. Uh-huh. Yes, please email it to us directly." Silence. No, she doesn't need a copy. Just send it to me." She hung up fast, and when she turned around, I noticed something new. Fear. Not of me, but of being found out. "Who was that?" I asked. "The clinic. About billing." She swallowed. "Nothing you need to worry about." I nodded as if convinced, but inside something shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity. Like a candle being lit in a dark room. Later that evening, after they'd gone to bed, I sat at the small desk in the corner of my bedroom. My joints were aching, but my mind was awake in a way I hadn't felt in years. I opened the drawer where I kept my mail, and I noticed an envelope that hadn't been there this morning, addressed to me, but with the flap already slightly torn, as if someone had opened it and then tried to hide the evidence. Inside was a notice from the bank. A request had been submitted to gain limited access to my accounts for financial oversight due to cognitive concerns. No signatures, no explanation, just a request. Submitted by someone who shared my address. My heart didn't race. It didn't have to. At my age, fear doesn't run. It settles. Heavy, cold, deliberate. I sat back in my chair and let the truth fill the room. The doctor wasn't evaluating my health. He was evaluating my capacity. And someone, very likely the two people sleeping under my roof, was planning a future that didn't include me making my own decisions. I closed the envelope, smoothing it flat with my palm. If they thought I was going to fade quietly into the background, they hadn't learned much about me in 79 years. Age doesn't erase a spine. It simply hides it until it's needed. And tonight, I felt mine straighten, piece by piece. By morning, the house felt even smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. I moved slowly, Not because of age, but because every sound seemed loaded with meaning. The hush of Clara's slippers in the hallway, the faint click of Mark's laptop, the quiet, careful way they avoided speaking to me unless absolutely necessary. People talk differently when they're hiding something. Their sentences shorten, their eyes drift, their kindness comes measured, not natural. When I stepped into the kitchen, Clara was already there, stirring her coffee with the frantic rhythm of someone trying to calm herself. "You slept well, Mom?" she asked, without turning. "I slept enough," I answered, taking a seat. "Did you?" She stiffened for a moment, then smiled at the counter instead of at me. "Of course. Just tired. Long day yesterday." Long day. Yes, for them. Nothing drains energy like lying. On the table lay a stack of envelopes I didn't remember seeing before. Bills, advertisements, and one official-looking letter addressed to Clara. She reached for it too quickly when she noticed my eyes drift toward it. "Work stuff," she muttered, sliding it under a magazine. That was when I realized something important. They were no longer acting like caregivers or family. They were acting like people preparing for a delicate operation. And I, unwittingly, was the patient. The kettle whistled. Clara poured, but didn't sit. Instead, she hovered, pretending to tidy the same corner of the counter over and over again. "Mom, later today, Mark wants to go over some organizational things with you. Just small decisions. Nothing major." "What kind of decisions?" "Oh, emergency contacts, plans for the future, just in case." Just in case. I'd heard enough euphemisms in my life to recognize one more when I heard it. Mark entered the kitchen then, dressed too neatly for a Saturday. Papers in hand. Papers he hid the moment he saw me watching him. "Morning," he said. Only to Clara. I stood and walked to the back door, pretending to check the weather. Cool air slipped in, carrying the scent of damp earth. For years, this house had been my refuge. Quiet mornings, my garden, the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Yet now, even the familiar felt uncertain, as if someone had begun planning where my belongings would go once I wasn't living here anymore. Later, while Clara showered and Mark left to pick up groceries, I wandered the hallway. I'm not proud of what I did next, but survival sometimes requires letting go of pride. I opened their office door. Nothing dramatic, just faint traces of what they'd been doing. A folder left slightly askew. A document half shoved into a drawer. 2 pens arranged with obsessive neatness. I sat cautiously, feeling like a trespasser in my own home. On top of the desk was a printed checklist titled Capacity and Safety Evaluation, Preliminary Requirements. I didn't have to read more. The title alone was enough. It explained everything. The doctor's single question, Clara's bright, hollow cheerfulness, Mark's sudden interest in my daily habits. Someone had started a process, and those processes never favored the person being evaluated. My hands didn't shake. Age had taught me steadiness, but my breath did come slower as I turned the next page. Suggested next steps. Secure financial oversight. Initiate care placement options. Limit independent decision-making. Limit independent decision-making. As if independence were something they could simply switch off like a lamp. A floorboard creaked. Light, approaching footsteps. I slid the documents back exactly as they were and stepped away from the desk just as Clara opened the door. "Oh, Mom," she said, startled. "I didn't know you were in here." I was looking for my reading glasses. "They're in your room," she replied too quickly. "Let me help you." "I know where my own things are," I said calmly. The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled too tight. For the first time, Clara looked at me not as an aging mother, but as an obstacle. Something she needed to manage. I walked past her and down the hallway, holding my posture the way a woman must when others expect her to fold. At my bedroom door, I paused. I could feel her eyes on my back. "Clara," I said without turning, "you forget that I've been an adult much longer than you have." I didn't wait for her answer. When I closed the door behind me, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. They thought they were preparing quietly, gently, cleverly. But I had seen enough. They were building a future without me in it, except as a signature, a form, or an empty room. And if they were ready to move the pieces on the board, then I would learn to move mine too. By late afternoon, the house felt crowded with silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that presses against your ribs, waiting for you to break it first. I stepped outside just to breathe air that didn't belong to Clara and Mark. The sun hung low, dim behind thin clouds, and the yard, my yard, looked strangely foreign, as if someone else had already imagined it without me. Next door, Mrs. Davenport was watering her dahlias, her thin shoulders bent but stubborn. She was 83, but she still moved with the quiet precision of someone who had been underestimated her whole life. She waved. "Margaret, dear, you're out early today." I walked over to the fence. Couldn't stay inside. The air felt heavy. She chuckled in that dry way old women do, as if the world has never surprised them. Not really. Heavy air means someone in that house is thinking too loudly. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "You could say that." Mrs. Davenport turned off the hose and looked at me more closely. "People our age don't ask questions right away. We wait, we observe, we listen between words. Your daughter seemed in a hurry this morning," she said quietly. "Nearly ran me over backing out. She and Mark have been organized lately." "Ah." Mrs. Davenport nodded slowly. "That kind of organized." She didn't need to explain. I'd heard her stories over the years, about nieces and nephews sniffing around her will, about neighbors whose children changed locks on their houses in the name of safety. There's always a polite word for cruelty when it comes from family. "Tell me something," she said softly. "When was the last time someone in that house asked how you were instead of what you needed?" I didn't answer. My silence was enough. She leaned on the fence. "You're not losing your mind, Margaret. You're noticing. And sometimes people don't like when the person they're underestimating starts paying attention." A strange thing happened then. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, but recognition. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being dramatic. Someone else could see it too. Before I could respond, the back door opened. "Mom!" Clara called sharply. "Can you come in for a minute? We need to talk." Mrs. Davenport raised an eyebrow, silently urging me to stand tall. I nodded to her and walked back to the house. Inside, Mark was at the dining table with a stack of papers, all aligned too neatly, as if tidiness could disguise intention. "We want to go over some options," he began, gesturing to a chair. "Sit, Mom," Clara added, chest tight, fingers fidgeting. She'd never fidgeted before, not even when she was a girl with scraped knees. That alone told me more than their words. I did not sit. "What options?" I asked. "Long-term planning," Mark said. "Nothing urgent, just responsible." "I've been responsible longer than you've been alive," I answered. My voice wasn't sharp. It was level, heavy, controlled. They exchanged a glance, a dangerous one, a practiced one. We just think, Clara began, choosing each word like it might explode, that the house is becoming too much for you, and maybe it's time to consider. No. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It hung in the air like a brick falling through water. Mom, she tried again, we're only thinking about your safety. Are you? I asked. Is that what yesterday was about? My safety? They froze. People do that when their plan has one too many cracks. You took me to a doctor I've never met, I continued. You didn't tell me why. He asked me one question and ended the visit. And this morning, someone contacted my bank about financial oversight. Mark's jaw twitched. Clara's lips parted as if words might spill out, but nothing came. Finally, Mark exhaled. You misunderstood. No, I said. I understood perfectly. Clara folded her arms, a defensive gesture. Mom, you can't manage everything like you used to. We're trying to help. Help, I repeated softly, turning the word over as if testing its edges. By removing my choices, my independence, my dignity? That's not fair, Clara whispered. Neither is lying to me. The silence that followed was the longest yet, stretching from one wall to the next. And then, slowly, Clara's face shifted, not remorseful, not ashamed, something worse, annoyed, as if my refusal were an inconvenience. Mark shuffled the papers, clearing his throat. We can discuss this later when you're calmer. Ah, there it was, the oldest trick in the book. Discredit the emotional state of the person who stands in your way. I'm calm, I said. Calmer than you deserve. I walked away before either of them could speak again. Their words chased me anyway. Soft, frustrated whispers, the sound of people who had expected compliance and were surprised by resistance. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and let the quiet wash over me. They thought they were planning my future, but they had forgotten one important truth. A woman my age has very little left to fear, and absolutely nothing left to lose. I spent the rest of the evening moving through the house as quietly as a shadow, touching things I had dusted and polished for decades, noticing details I had never bothered to see before. When you feel threatened in your own home, every object turns into a witness. The hallway mirror caught my reflection as I passed. I paused, not out of vanity, but out of habit. The woman looking back at me wasn't frightened. Her shoulders were straight. Her jaw was set. There was a steadiness in her eyes that even age couldn't soften. This was not the face of someone who needed a guardian. Downstairs, Clara and Mark spoke in hushed tones, their words drifting upward like smoke. I didn't catch the sentences, only the cadence, tight, hurried, irritated. They were planning their next move, and they thought I was too distracted, too old, too dependent to notice. I walked into the living room and sat in my old armchair, folding my blanket across my lap the way I always had. The house was dim except for the soft glow of the lamp beside me. I liked this hour of the day, when the world felt slower and you could hear your own thoughts without interruption. For years, this armchair had held more weight than just my body. I had listened here, held hands here, survived bad news here. And now, surprisingly, it was where I gathered myself again. My fingers traced the armrest as if stroking the back of an old friend. Down the hallway, the stairs creaked. The fourth one from the top. The one Mark kept promising he'd fix. I heard him come down, head to the fridge, open and close it with the careless confidence of a man who believes the world is on his side. Did she say anything else? He whispered when he rejoined Clara in the dining room. Nothing. She's just... being difficult. Then we need to move things along. I didn't move, didn't breathe deeply. I simply listened. We can't wait weeks, Mark hissed. The bank needs confirmation soon. I know, Clara snapped under her breath, but she's suspicious now. Suspicious? They said it like it was a flaw, as if awareness were a symptom. Their voices dropped again. I closed my eyes, not from exhaustion, but because anger, at my age, doesn't explode. It gathers, thickens, settles in the chest like a stone warming under the sun. Eventually, they went upstairs, their footsteps retreating into silence. Only then did I allow myself to move. I stood, slowly, and walked to the window. The yard was dark except for the porch light spilling onto the steps. Everything looked so calm, so peaceful, even though something corrosive had been eating away at that peace for years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. But now the truth was fully awake. I pressed my palm against the glass and let the cold seep into my skin. In the distance, Mrs. Davenport's bedroom light flicked off. The neighborhood settled. I stayed there for a minute longer, breathing evenly, letting the night hold me still. Then I turned and walked to the small writing desk in the corner of the living room, the one no one paid attention to, the one with the broken drawer that only I knew how to open without making a sound. Inside was a stack of my documents, insurance papers, tax forms, property deeds, bank statements, things I had kept organized through decades of widowhood and everyday life. If Clara and Mark thought they were the only ones who could handle responsibilities, then they had forgotten who held this family together long before they grew clever. I took out the deed to the house and laid it on the desk. The paper looked ordinary, but it held my entire adult life, my work, my sacrifices, my years of doing without so others could have enough. I wasn't ready to make any decisions about it tonight, but I needed to touch it, to remind myself that this place wasn't theirs to distribute. The old clock in the hallway ticked past midnight. I returned the papers to the drawer, leaving everything exactly as it was. I didn't want them to know I'd begun to move my own pieces on the board. Before going upstairs, I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness. If they were building a quiet trap for me, they were about to learn something they should have known all along. A woman who has lived nearly 80 years doesn't survive by being naive. She survives by watching, waiting, and choosing the exact moment to strike. And my moment was getting closer. By morning, I had made a decision, not about what to do next, but about what I would no longer tolerate. Fear was a luxury for people who still believed they had something left to lose. I had lived too long, survived too much, to let whispered schemes unravel the last pieces of my independence. I dressed slowly, choosing my clothes the way one chooses armor. A clean blouse, my warm cardigan, the good shoes I wore when I wanted to be taken seriously. Clara watched me from the kitchen doorway as I came downstairs. "Going somewhere?" she asked. "I am." "Where?" "To a doctor," I replied calmly. Her face twitched, a blink, a tightening of the jaw. "Which doctor?" "One I trust." She opened her mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. "Do you want us to drive you?" "No." The word sat between us like a heavy stone. She swallowed hard. Mark came down the stairs just in time to hear my next sentence. "I made the appointment myself." That startled them both more than anything else could have. Because appointments imply initiative. Initiative implies clarity. Clarity destroys whatever narrative they had begun building. Mark managed a weak smile. Well, good. It's good you're staying on top of things. I always have, I replied. I took my purse, my keys, and walked to the door. Clara followed me halfway. Mom, she said softer now, don't overthink things. Yesterday was just an evaluation, nothing serious. Serious enough that you won't let me read the report. Her eyes darted away. Outside, the morning air felt cool and honest. Cars hummed in the distance, birds rustled in the hedges, the world moved in its usual rhythm, unlike the house I had just walked out of. I took a cab to the clinic downtown, a modest place with an aging sign and mismatched chairs in the waiting area. It looked nothing like the sleek office Clara had dragged me to, and that alone felt like safety. When the nurse called my name, I followed her down the short hallway. Dr. Patel greeted me with a warm, tired smile, the kind doctors wear after years of listening to real people instead of charts. What brings you in today, Mrs. Hill? I need someone to look me in the eye, I said, taking a seat. And tell me the truth. He nodded, as if he had heard that very request 1,000 times. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I told him everything, how Clara and Mark took me to a doctor I'd never seen, how he asked only one bizarre question, how the visit ended almost immediately, how a request had been sent to the bank about my cognitive concerns. Dr. Patel's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Concern, disapproval, recognition. Mrs. Hill, he said gently, what you're describing is not a medical evaluation. It sounds more like a preliminary capacity screening. A screening for what? He hesitated, a careful, ethical silence. To determine whether someone might be legally declared unable to manage their own affairs. I felt the words settle in my chest like stones dropped in water. Not surprising, not shocking, just confirming what I already feared. They can't do that without my consent, I said. They shouldn't, he corrected softly. But families sometimes pursue these evaluations under the guise of routine checkups, especially if they want access to finances or property. I sat very still. Tell me honestly, I said. Am I losing my mind? He shook his head immediately. No, you're lucid, aware, logical, and articulate. I can administer cognitive tests today, if you'd like. Not because you need them to prove something to me, but because you may need documentation. Documentation. That word felt strangely powerful. Yes, I said. Please. The tests weren't difficult. He asked about dates, names, patterns, simple tasks. Tasks a woman losing herself would struggle with. But my mind was clear, steady, unblurred. When we finished, he sat back, hands folded. Mrs. Hill, you have no signs of cognitive impairment. None. I exhaled slowly. Not relief, not pride, but validation. A confirmation of what I already knew. The danger wasn't coming from inside me. It was coming from the people who believed I wouldn't fight back. I'll prepare a written summary, he said, and you should keep it somewhere safe. If anyone challenges your capacity, this will help you. Safe. Yes. I would find a place for it. As I left his office, he stopped me. One more thing, he said gently. You're not the first person I've seen in this situation, and you're not powerless. You have more options than you think. I nodded, thanked him, and stepped outside. The sunlight felt different now, warmer, firmer, like a hand on my back guiding me forward. Clara and Mark had taken the first step in their little campaign, and now, finally, I was taking mine. By the time I returned home, the sky had shifted into that pale afternoon color that makes everything look a little washed out, a little tired. I felt neither tired nor washed out. I felt sharpened, like someone had dragged a whetstone across my spine. Clara was waiting in the living room. She stood up the moment I walked in, too quickly, as if she'd been listening for the sound of the key in the lock. "You were gone a long time," she said. "I had a long appointment." "With whom?" Her voice wobbled at the edges just slightly. "A doctor," I replied, setting my purse down. "A real one." She flinched as if slapped. "Mom, don't be dramatic." I wasn't aware I was being dramatic. I was under the impression I was being evaluated like livestock yesterday. She pressed her lips together. "That's unfair." "What's unfair," I answered, removing my cardigan, "is being taken to a stranger under false pretenses." Before she could reply, Mark came in from the kitchen. "Well?" he asked, too eager, too prepared. "What did they say?" "That I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions." A flicker, no more than a breath, crossed his face. Disappointment, and not even well hidden. Clara forced a smile. "Good. We're glad. Really." I walked past them. "Of course you are." But the truth hung in the air like the aftertaste of something bitter. They weren't glad. My clarity was an inconvenience. Upstairs, in the quiet of my room, I placed Dr. Patel's report in the drawer with my deed. 2 small pieces of paper, but suddenly they felt like anchors. Steady, undeniable, mine. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muted hum of their voices downstairs. They weren't whispering now. They were arguing, quietly but urgently. The house carried their tones up the staircase. "She's onto us," Mark muttered. "I didn't think she'd go behind our backs," Clara snapped. "Why would she? She's never." "She's not as easy to manage as you thought." Manage. The word landed in my chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Not help, not support, not care. Manage. I closed my eyes. Let the sound settle into me. Old age teaches you something important. Pain becomes a teacher long before it becomes a weakness. The voices went on. "We need to move quickly," Mark said. Before what?" Clara sounded panicked. "Before I decide my life belongs to me again? Before I dare to insist I am the same woman who built this house, paid these bills, survived their father's absence and the world's indifference? Before they lose control of the future they imagined without me?" I stood, steady as ever, and walked to the window. The sky outside was turning bruised, gray, then blue, then something in between. A bird hopped along the fence, unbothered, unaware that inside this house someone was quietly trying to carve away at my autonomy. I breathed slowly, letting the cool air brush against my skin. When you're young, defiance burns hot and fast. When you're nearly 80, defiance settles differently. It thickens, deepens. It becomes the ground you stand on. Dinner was quiet that evening. Too quiet. Clara kept looking at me as if waiting for me to break into fragments. Mark pretended to scroll through his phone again. I ate my soup with deliberate calm. When the meal ended, Clara reached out, touching my hand lightly. "Mom, we want what's best for you." I pulled my hand back. Gently, not cruelly, but clearly. "You want what's easiest for you?" I said. Her eyes shimmered, not with sorrow, but with frustration. She had grown so used to my compliance that resistance felt like betrayal. "I'm still your daughter," she said softly, "and I'm still your mother." I held her gaze. "Not your project." The words settled heavily between us. That night, The house was unbearably quiet. No creaking staircase, no late-night television, no murmured conversation. Just silence. Dense. Expectant. I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I'd known loneliness before. It had visited me when my husband died, when friends moved away or passed on. But this wasn't loneliness. This was something colder. A solitude imposed by the very people who should have been my shelter. Around midnight, I rose, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and went downstairs. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't need them. I knew every corner of this house by heart. I sat in my armchair and folded my hands in my lap. If they had expected me to fade into confusion, they had miscalculated. If they had expected me to accept their plans, they had mistaken my silence for surrender. If they had expected an old woman too tired to resist, well, they were about to learn exactly what age can look like when dignity is the only thing left worth fighting for. I woke before sunrise, not because of my age or aching joints, but because my mind was already awake, sharp as a blade pulled from its sheath. The house was silent, too silent for a place meant to contain 3 adults. They were avoiding me now. Guilt has a way of making people tiptoe. I boiled water for tea, letting the kettle's whistle fill the kitchen. It sounded almost triumphant, as if announcing something I already knew. The time for waiting was over. At 7:30, I dressed neatly, packed a folder into my purse, and left the house without saying a word. Clara's bedroom light flicked on as I closed the door, but she didn't dare follow me. Good. The legal clinic was a small brick building wedged between a bakery and a shop that sold stationery for schoolchildren. The sign on the door read, "Community assistance and legal aid, all are welcome." It wasn't glamorous, but it had something I needed more than glamour: independence. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright scarf, smiled warmly. "Good morning. How can we help you?" "My name is Margaret Hill," I said. "I need advice regarding family interference in my personal affairs." Her expression softened, not with pity, but with recognition. I wasn't the first. "Of course," she said. "Please take a seat. Someone will be right with you." After a few minutes, a man in his 50s entered the waiting area. He had gentle eyes, a tired posture, and a careful way of speaking. "Mrs. Hill? I'm attorney Jonathan Pierce. Come with me." His office was small, with old carpet and stacks of folders piled in what he probably called a system. But I trusted him instantly. You don't need polish when you have sincerity. "Tell me what's happening," he said as soon as I sat down. So I did. Every detail. The unfamiliar doctor, the one question, the rushed appointment, the torn envelope from the bank, the whispers in my house, the documents on Mark's desk, their attempt to manage me. When I finished, Pierce didn't look surprised, just disappointed, for my sake, not theirs. "This is becoming increasingly common," he said quietly. "Adult children using capacity evaluations to gain control of assets, sometimes out of greed, sometimes out of misguided ideas about safety. But in your case," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "it sounds intentional." I nodded. I already knew that much. He leaned forward. "Mrs. Hill, let me ask you this plainly. Do you feel you are fully capable of living independently and making your own decisions?" "Yes." "And do you have medical documentation that supports this?" I slid Dr. Patel's cognitive assessment from my purse and placed it on his desk. Pierce read it slowly, nodding. "Excellent. This is exactly what we need." "We?" I asked. "Only if you want my help." but I'd be glad to assist you. I felt something loosen inside my chest. Gratitude. Not the fragile kind, but the sturdy kind that grows from being believed. He continued, "There are several steps we can take to protect your autonomy. First, we'll draft a declaration of your capacity. It's a legal document stating you are fully competent. Second, we'll notify the bank that any request submitted without your consent is invalid." "And third?" I asked, sensing there was more. "Third," he said gently, "we can add protective measures to your property deed. Your home cannot be sold, transferred, or controlled by anyone but you." My breath caught. The thought of securing my house, my one sanctuary, brought a swell of emotion I hadn't expected. Pierce noticed. "Mrs. Hill, you are not powerless. They may think you are. They may be counting on it. But the law is on your side, not theirs." I nodded slowly. "What do you need from me right now?" "Your signature," he said. My hand didn't tremble as I signed the initial forms. It felt steady as the day I buried my husband, as steady as the years I kept this family together alone. When it was done, Pierce gathered the papers and stood. "We'll handle the rest. And Mrs. Hill, if they pressure you, intimidate you, or try anything else, call me directly, any hour." I thanked him and stepped outside. The breeze was stronger now, brushing against my cheeks. A woman passing by smiled kindly at me, just a stranger on the sidewalk, but her smile felt like a small blessing. I walked toward the bus stop instead of calling a cab. I wanted the time, the movement, the feel of my feet on solid ground. On the ride home, I looked at the faces around me. Young people, old people, tired people, hopeful people. None of them knew what I had done that morning. None of them knew that today I had quietly reclaimed my life. But I knew, and so would Clara and Mark soon enough. When I stepped through the front door, they were both waiting for me, their mouths tight, their eyes anxious. "Where were you?" Clara demanded. I closed the door behind me gently, softly, with a calm that made them both visibly uneasy. "Out," I said, "taking care of my future." And for the first time, I watched fear flicker, real fear, across their faces. Not because I was confused, but because I was not. They hovered around me for the rest of the afternoon, as if afraid I might say something they weren't prepared to hear. I moved through the house calmly, quietly, letting them wonder what exactly I had done. Fear grows best in silence. Clara finally cornered me in the kitchen while I sliced an apple. "Mom," she began, forcing a smile, "we just want to talk. You've been distant." "I've been thinking," I replied. "That's what worries us," she said too quickly, then winced at her own words. I set the knife down. "Worrying about me isn't the same as deciding things for me." She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Can't we just sit down and figure out a plan together?" "You tried to do that already," I said. "Without me." Before she could answer, Mark walked in, hands shoved in his pockets, a man trying hard to look calm and failing miserably. "Margaret," he said, "this tension isn't good for anyone. If we could all act like adults—" "I am acting like an adult," I interrupted. "The problem is you expected me not to." His cheeks flushed. He wasn't used to being spoken to without deference. Clara stepped forward. "We're just worried about the future." "And I'm concerned about the present," I said. "Specifically the parts of it you've tried to rearrange." The room stilled. Something wordless passed between the two of them. Panic wearing the mask of patience. Mark cleared his throat. Mom, we saw you leave early. You were gone for hours. We'd just like to know where you were. Out, I said, handling my affairs. That shook them. Properly. Your affairs? Clara repeated, her voice rising. Why didn't you tell us? Because you don't tell me, I answered simply. She swallowed, blinking hard. We're family. We should share things. You mean, I said softly, you want information for strategy. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose. This is ridiculous. But it wasn't, and he knew it. After dinner, another tension-soaked ritual, we dispersed. But an hour later, I heard hushed voices coming from their bedroom. The house carried sound. Old houses always do. She's getting help, Clara whispered. I know it. How? Mark snapped. I don't know, but she's different. A pause. Do you think she ruined the evaluation? He asked. It's possible. Damn it. A soft, muffled sob. Clara. I didn't want it to go this way, she whispered. I just thought, if we handled things early, we'd avoid a crisis later. Mark's voice lowered. We still have options. Options. That word chilled the air. I leaned closer to the banister, listening. We could request a second evaluation, he murmured. Or escalate the financial oversight. The bank already has the initial form. But if she's on to us, Clara said, she'll fight. Fight. The words slipped through me like a quiet spark. They said it as if I hadn't been fighting my whole life. Just quietly, invisibly, in ways they never cared to notice. I returned to my room before they could emerge. I didn't want them finding me listening. Not yet. Inside, I turned on the small lamp beside my bed. Its warm glow filled the room with a softness their voices couldn't reach. I opened the drawer again and touched the legal papers Jonathan Pierce had given me earlier. Real protection, real support. Not the kind wrapped in false concern. They thought my age made me fragile. They forgot my age also made me free. Free of needing their approval. Free of fearing their disappointment. Free of pretending not to see their intentions. Tonight, as their whispers faded into uneasy sleep, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even sadness, but resolve. They were planning their next move. Good. So was I. And unlike them, I wasn't improvising. I was preparing. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of morning that feels like it could shatter if touched too quickly. I moved quietly through the house, listening, not because I needed to, but because listening had become my greatest advantage. Clara and Mark were already in the kitchen. Their conversation dropped into an uneasy silence the moment I walked in. I made tea without asking them anything. Sometimes silence forces people to reveal more than questions do. I carried my mug to the dining table and sat. Mark cleared his throat, pretending to read something on his phone. Clara fidgeted with the sleeves of her sweater. Mom, she began, we thought, maybe we could all go through some paperwork today, just a few planning documents. I sipped my tea. What kind? Her voice trembled. Household things. Long-term things. I see, I said softly. And will these documents require my signature? Mark looked up sharply. Well, yes, some. And if I refuse? He hesitated, then gave a thin smile. Let's not make this difficult. I placed my mug down with care. Difficult? I repeated. Such an interesting word. It sounds so much like inconvenient. Neither of them spoke. I stood, walked to the counter, and opened the drawer where they kept their paperwork. I didn't touch anything, just looked. A simple gesture, but it was enough to make Clara's face blanch. "Where are the forms you want me to sign?" I asked. "We'll bring them later," Mark said quickly. "They're not here." He was lying. Badly. I turned to leave the kitchen when something caught my eye. A manila folder sticking out from beneath a stack of cookbooks. Its label was half hidden, but one word was visible: assessment. I didn't reach for it. I didn't have to. Clara saw where my gaze landed and lunged to block it. "Mom, that's private." "For whom?" I asked quietly. "You or me?" Her shoulders stiffened. "Don't start." But I already had. I left them and walked toward the stairs, expecting them to follow. They didn't. Fear immobilizes people before it moves them. Upstairs, I entered their office. I didn't snoop this time. I didn't need to. My eyes landed immediately on the corner of the desk, and the single sheet left just barely visible beneath a folder. It wasn't carelessness. It was arrogance. They thought I wouldn't dare look again. But I did. Without touching it, I read the visible line. Next steps. Pending confirmation. Transfer of financial authority. My throat tightened, not with panic, but with a quiet, simmering clarity. That's when I noticed the second page peeking out, an email printout. A single sentence was visible. Once declaration is finalized, property evaluation can proceed. Property. Not mother, not Margaret. Property. Footsteps sounded in the hall. I stepped away just in time as Clara appeared in the doorway. "Why are you in here?" she demanded. "Looking," I said, "not touching, just looking." "You can't come in without asking." "This is my house," I reminded her. She flinched. "Mom, please just let us handle things. You're making this harder than it has to be." "On whom?" I asked. "On you?" She exhaled shakily and ran a hand through her hair. "We're trying to protect you." "Then why?" I asked softly. "Are you hiding your protection?" Her face crumpled, not into remorse, but into frustration. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think." Before she could argue, Mark appeared behind her. His expression was tight, controlled, anger barely smoothed into civility. "Margaret," he said, "you need to trust us." "No," I replied. "I need you to stop assuming my life is negotiable." Their silence told me everything. I walked past them, down the hallway, steady despite the tremor moving through my chest. They followed me with their eyes, but not their feet. Predators pause when they realize their prey has teeth. In my bedroom, I closed the door gently and sat on the edge of the bed. I had seen enough. More than enough. I finally understood the shape of their intentions. Not guesses, not hints, but evidence. Paperwork. Plans. Procedures. They weren't waiting for me to fail. They were preparing to push. But they had miscalculated one thing. A woman does not reach 79 without learning how to survive people who underestimate her. I opened the drawer where my legal documents rested. Let them prepare their next steps. I had already taken mine. By evening, tension clung to the walls like humidity. Clara and Mark moved around the house with careful, deliberate steps. Two people rehearsing a conversation they were afraid to have. I could feel it building, the way one feels a storm approaching through pressure rather than sound. I sat in the living room, my hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting. Not because I owed them the courtesy, but because I wanted them to speak first. Sometimes silence is a weapon sharper than any accusation. Finally, Clara appeared in the doorway. Her face looked worn, creased not with age, but with guilt and fear. "Mom," she said softly, "can we talk?" Mark stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes narrowing with the kind of authority men give themselves without ever earning it. I nodded. Of course. They sat across from me on the sofa. Clara leaned forward, clasping her hands together. Mom, things have gotten tense between us. We didn't want that. You created it, I said, but gently. She swallowed. We thought we were doing the right thing. By lying? By hiding paperwork about my future? Mark stepped in. You're twisting this into something it's not. We're trying to protect you from making mistakes. Mistakes like what? I asked. Living my own life? He huffed, impatient. You're almost 80, Margaret. You shouldn't be handling everything alone. The house, the bills, your health. It's irresponsible. I've handled all of those things every day until now, I replied. And quite well. Clara's eyes glistened, but her voice didn't soften. We just wanted to set things up before it's too late. Too late for whom? I asked quietly. She looked away. Mom, she whispered. We read that early intervention helps avoid chaos later. We were trying to think ahead. And what did your thinking ahead involve? Transferring financial authority? Assessing my capacity behind my back? Making plans for my home without asking me? Her jaw trembled. We didn't mean to hurt you. No, I said. You meant to control me. The hurt was just collateral. Mark leaned forward, voice sharpening. Look, this is getting ridiculous. You're being stubborn out of pride, and it's putting you and your future at risk. And what about my present? I asked. Does that matter to either of you? He exhaled through his nose, frustrated. You're acting like we're villains. I held his gaze. No, you're acting like people who want something and are willing to take it quietly. The words hit harder than a shout would have. Clara's face folded, crumpling inward. Mom, please. We were scared. Of what? I asked. That I might outlive your timeline? That I might still have wants, choices, dignity? Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. But I didn't reach for her. Not this time. Her tears were not about me. They were about being caught. Mark straightened, preparing for his final argument. Margaret, we still think you should consider giving us shared authority. It's practical. No, I said simply, but no. The words settled into the room like stone into water, quiet, heavy, irreversible. Clara wiped her eyes. Then, what happens now? Now, I said, standing slowly, we stop pretending. You stop planning my life as if I'm already gone. And I stop allowing it. Silence stretched. A silence thick with realization. Mark's eyes flicked toward the hallway, where the office door stood slightly ajar. The paperwork inside no longer a secret. Clara whispered, Mom, are you going to fight us? I looked at her. My daughter, the child I fed, held, soothed. And I spoke not with anger, but with the clarity of a woman who had finally reclaimed her voice. I'm not fighting you, I said. I'm defending myself. A tremor ran through her, subtle but unmistakable. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Words fail when justification collapses. I turned toward the stairs. Behind me, Clara whispered, Mom, please don't do anything rash. I paused, hand on the banister. At my age, darling, I said quietly, rash would be letting others decide the rest of my life. I climbed the stairs without looking back. Their silence followed me up each step like a shadow. In my room, I closed the door, exhaled, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not victory. Resolve. The kind that comes only when the truth has been spoken aloud. They had cornered me. But tonight, for the first time, I had cornered them back. The next morning arrived with a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Clara and Mark avoided me entirely. No cheerful greetings, no offers of coffee, no attempts at conversation. They weren't angry. They were calculating. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, made my tea, and sat at the table with the quiet dignity they kept forgetting I possessed. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Jonathan Pierce. Documents filed. Bank notified. Your assets are protected. Call if anything changes. A wave of steady warmth moved through me. Not relief, not triumph, but the grounding certainty of having firm ground under my feet again. I placed the phone face down on the table, letting the message settle into my bones. A half hour later, Mark entered the kitchen, trying too hard to look casual. He poured himself a mug of coffee, not meeting my eyes. "Morning," he muttered. "Morning," I replied. He hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "Clara said you were upset last night." "I was honest," I corrected. "There's a difference." He exhaled slowly. "Margaret, we had plans, practical plans. And now you've, well, complicated things." I looked at him steadily. "Your plans involved removing my authority. I didn't complicate anything. I prevented it." His jaw tightened. For the first time, I could see the frustration he'd been trying to hide. "We were doing what's best for everyone." "For everyone," I repeated softly. "Except me." Before he could respond, Clara entered the kitchen. Her eyes were red, but her chin was lifted in a way that always meant she was ready to double down rather than apologize. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk." "No," I replied. "You need to listen." She stiffened, shocked by the refusal. "I've contacted a lawyer," I continued, voice calm. "I've put protections in place, financial, legal, personal. This house, my accounts, none of it can be altered without my approval." Their faces changed instantly, fear flickering into view like a match being struck. What?" Clara whispered. "Why would you do that?" "Because," I said, "you tried to make decisions about my life behind my back. You involved a doctor. You contacted the bank. You began preparing documents I was never meant to see." "That's not fair," she murmured. "It's accurate," I replied. Mark stepped forward, anger creeping into his tone. "Margaret, do you have any idea how this makes us look? You went to a lawyer?" "Yes." "You're treating us like criminals." "I'm treating you like people who forced my hand." He fell silent. My words weren't dramatic. They were simply true. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. "Mom, we were scared. We were trying to think ahead." "You were thinking ahead," I said, "to a future where I don't get a say." The quiet that followed was thick and brittle. For the first time, they saw me not as someone to be maneuvered, but as someone standing firmly in her own defense. I stood up, smoothing my cardigan. "I'm going out for a walk. When I return, we'll continue living in this house with honesty, or we won't continue living in it together at all." Clara gasped softly. Mark's eyebrows shot up. I didn't wait for their reply. Outside, the cold air filled my lungs like truth. The winter light fell across the quiet street, painting everything in muted colors. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I realized I felt neither old nor fragile. I felt sovereign. Let them scramble. Let them recalculate. Let them whisper their next plan. Mine was already in motion. Signed, sealed, protected. And this time, I wasn't moving quietly. Not anymore. I walked for nearly an hour, letting the cold air scrape the noise out of my head. When you reach my age, you learn that clarity rarely comes indoors. It comes from movement, from stepping away, from giving yourself room to breathe outside the reach of other people's intentions. By the time I returned, the house stood unnaturally still, as if waiting to see which version of me would walk through the door. The quiet, compliant woman they'd counted on for years, or the one who'd just protected her life with a few signatures and a steady hand. I stepped inside. Clara and Mark were sitting at the dining table, their bodies angled away from each other, but their tension braided together like two strands of the same rope. Clara looked up first. Her eyes were swollen, but her mouth had hardened into a thin line. "Mom, we didn't expect this." "You didn't expect resistance," I corrected, taking off my coat. "But resistance tends to appear when someone feels cornered." Mark pushed his chair back and stood. "We never wanted things to get ugly." "Neither did I," said softly. "But you set the tone." He shook his head, frustrated. "All we ever did was try to make sure you're safe." "Safe?" I met his eyes. "Or managed?" His silence was answer enough. Clara rose too, wringing her hands. "Mom, can we stop this before it gets worse? Please, we're all upset. The lawyer, those documents, you blindsided us." I approached the table slowly, deliberately, the way one approaches a fragile object that might crack under pressure. "You blindsided me first," I said. "You made decisions about my future without asking if I wanted that future." "We didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," I replied. "And worse, you didn't think you were hurting me at all. You thought I wouldn't notice." Her face crumpled at that, a flicker of shame passing across it like a shadow. Mark tried another tactic, voice calmer now. "Margaret, we can work this out. We're family." "Yes," I said. "Which is why I'm giving you the courtesy of honesty." I pulled out a chair and sat, folding my hands on the table. They mirrored me hesitantly, like chastened children. "I'm not moving," I said. "I'm not giving you authority. I'm not surrendering my independence because you're anxious about the passage of time." Clara's breath hitched. "We thought we were preparing, before anything happened." "What you were preparing," I said, "was a world where I had no say." Mark exhaled, long and slow. "So what now? You lock everything down and pretend this never happened?" "No," I answered. "I remember exactly what happened, and I adjust my expectations accordingly." They exchanged a glance, fear mixing with a dawning understanding. The landscape had shifted. They were no longer the ones holding the reins. Clara reached out, her voice shaking. "Mom, do you hate us now?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised, fed, comforted, protected, and felt a quiet sorrow settle in my chest. Not hate, never hate, but something colder, heavier. "No," I said. "I don't hate you, but I don't trust you." The words ran through the room like a cold wind. Clara's hand dropped onto her lap. Mark stared at the table, jaw clenched. Trust is the currency of family, and they had spent all of theirs without realizing it. "I'm not your enemy," I continued, "but I will defend myself. And from now on, every decision I make will be based on what you've shown me, not on what I once hoped you were." They had no reply, none that mattered. I rose, steady on my feet. This house will stay mine. My choices will stay mine. My life will stay mine. Clara whispered, "We didn't think you'd go this far." I paused at the doorway, turning just enough to meet her eyes. And that, I said quietly, was your mistake. I went upstairs, each step measured, unhurried. Behind me, the house absorbed their subdued murmurs, the sound of two people realizing they had lost control of the story they tried to write. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the ground beneath me belong to me again. The morning after our confrontation felt strangely calm, not peaceful. Peace requires trust, but quiet in a way that told me something had shifted permanently. Clara and Mark moved through the house like guests instead of owners, tiptoeing around me as though any sound might provoke another declaration of independence. I made my tea slowly, savoring the small ritual. Routine is a kind of anchor. It reminds you that you still have your own shape, even when others try to redraw the outline. Clara brushed past me on her way to the fridge, but she didn't meet my eyes. Mark offered a stiff nod, like a man acknowledging a judge whose verdict he fears but must respect. Good. Let them sit with discomfort. It was time they felt the consequences of underestimating me. After breakfast, I went to the living room and opened the curtains wide. Light flooded the room, touching every corner that had spent too long in their shadow. I watched the street for a while. Children walking to school, neighbors heading to work, the daily rhythm of lives that didn't revolve around controlling mine. The thought came quietly at first, then clearer. I didn't have to stay here. Not with this tension. Not with these walls that now remembered every lie. Not with people who had begun measuring my life as if preparing for an estate sale. I hadn't considered leaving before. This house was full of history, 40 years of it. But history can also become a cage when the present sours. I sat down at my small writing desk and took out a notepad. I wrote the names of 3 places I'd always imagined living in someday. That mythical time women postpone until their lives belong to no one but themselves. A quiet coastal town 2 hours away, a small village near the mountains. A senior community with independent cottages where neighbors greet you like friends rather than opportunists. I didn't need to choose yet. Just knowing I could choose made something inside me unclench for the first time in weeks. Around noon, Clara tapped on my door. A timid sound. I told her to come in. She hovered in the doorway, twisting her fingers. "Mom, I feel like you're slipping away from us." "I'm not slipping," I said. "I'm stepping back. There's a difference." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I never wanted to fight with you." "You didn't fight," I replied. "You decided, and you expected me to comply." She flinched at that. I didn't soften the blow. "Mom," she whispered, "are you planning something?" "I'm planning my life," I answered. "The same way you tried to plan it for me." She sank onto the edge of the bed, shoulders trembling. I thought you'd be safer if we took care of everything." "But taking care of me," I said quietly, "and taking control of me are not the same." She didn't argue. She couldn't. I watched her. My daughter, who had grown into a woman who feared loss more than she understood love. For a moment, a small ache bloomed in my chest. Not pity. Not softness. Just recognition. "You and Mark will need time," I said. "Time to understand that I am not a burden. Time to accept that I still belong to myself." She nodded faintly, wiping her eyes. "And what do you need?" I looked around the room. My books, my blankets, my memories. Then back at her. "Space," I said. "A place where I'm not managed or monitored. Somewhere I can breathe again." Her breath caught, but she didn't protest. She knew. On some level, she had known for days. When she left the room, I sat again at my desk, hands steady as I folded the list of places into my purse. I wasn't running away. I was choosing. For the first time in a long while, I was choosing. And the horizon, distant, quiet, promising, felt suddenly closer than ever. The decision settled inside me quietly, the way evening light settles over a room, soft, inevitable, and strangely gentle. Once you recognize the shape of your freedom, you stop asking permission to step toward it. 2 days later, I stood at the kitchen table with my suitcase open beside me. Not a big one, just enough for clothes, my books, my documents, and the long wool scarf I kept for cold mornings. Clara watched from the doorway, pale and silent, her hands gripping the frame as though it were the only steady thing left. "You're really leaving," she whispered. "Yes," I said, "for a while." "Where will you go?" "A small coastal town," I answered. "A quiet place with an apartment near the water. I found it yesterday." I didn't tell her how it felt to speak to someone who actually listened, an agent who heard my voice, not my age. Clara blinked hard. "Mom, we can fix this. We can start over." "You can reflect," I said gently, "and I can breathe." Mark hovered behind her, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't shaken. But fear clung to him like static. Men like him were always confident until the day their certainty cracked. Today, it had shattered. "Margaret," he said, "running away won't change anything." "I'm not running," I replied. "I'm relocating my dignity." He had no answer for that. I zipped the suitcase with deliberate calm and lifted it. My joints protested, but only slightly. Age makes the body honest, not useless. Clara moved forward as if to take the weight from me, but I raised a hand. "No," I said. "I can carry my own things." Her face twisted, regret, shame, confusion, blending into something fragile. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom." "I know you didn't mean to," I said. "But you did. And intentions don't erase consequences." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she stepped back, giving me space. A gift she should have given months ago. I walked through the house slowly, letting my fingertips brush the familiar surfaces. The hallway mirror, the banister, the edge of the bookshelf where every memory still lived in the quiet. I wasn't abandoning the house. I was simply no longer offering it as collateral in someone else's fear. At the door, I paused. They waited behind me, 2 adults suddenly looking far younger than their years. "Before I go," I said softly, "you need to hear something." They straightened, bracing. "I don't leave with anger. I leave with understanding. You didn't see me clearly because you never imagined I could stand up to you. You mistook my patience for helplessness." Clara blinked rapidly. Mark looked down. "But I am not finished yet," I continued. "Not as a woman, not as a mind, not as myself." I reached for the door. "And if you want a place in my life going forward, you'll need to approach me as an equal, not as a problem to be solved." The silence behind me was thick, but it wasn't hostile now. It was humbled. Outside, the cab idled at the curb. The air smelled of cold salt, carried inland on a stray breeze, a promise of the sea that waited for me a few towns away. I walked toward the car with steady steps. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't tremble. I felt grounded, rooted not in a house, but in myself. As the cab pulled away, the street stretched out before me like a clean page. I didn't look back. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally trusted myself to move forward. The coastline came into view as we approached the highway. Gray waves, open sky, a horizon that didn't ask me to shrink or disappear, a place where my life could be mine again, unmonitored and uncontained. And when we crossed into the next town, I felt something warm unfold inside my chest, a quiet triumph, a reclamation of self, the unmistakable breath of freedom. At nearly 80, some people believe a woman is nearing her end. But I've learned something far more powerful. Sometimes the end is simply the beginning you choose for yourself. And if you're reading this, if you've ever felt ignored, dismissed, or quietly pushed aside, hear me now from the calm strength of my new beginning. Stand up. Protect what is yours. And don't wait for permission to reclaim your life.